thanks for everybody for coming. It's nice to see some familiar faces. Hey, Joel. I'm going to talk a little bit today about our Seabird restoration program here in Channel Islands National Park. So I'm going to keep it pretty simple. I'll give you just a brief overview of what the Montrose Settlements Restoration Program is all about. I'm going to focus primarily on our flagship project, which is our Santa Barbara Island alcid habitat restoration. We're mainly focusing on two species on that island, the Cassin's Auklet and the Xantus' Murrelet. And our sort of overall goal for both species is to restore nesting habitat, and that means native plant habitat restoration. So the Montrose Settlements Restoration Program, you guys can look it up online for more information. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it tonight. But basically, there was a lawsuit brought against Montrose Chemical and other defendants. The lawsuit was brought in 1990 and settled in 2001 for a cool $140.2 million. A trustee council was created to oversee the funds that went into specifically natural resource damagement funds. So that's on the ground restoration. And that council is comprised of 6 different representatives from 6 different agencies, all government agencies, 3 state and 3 federal. They published their Phase 1 restoration plan in 2005. That included an environmental impact statement for all of the projects. And I want to point out that that plan encompasses not just seabirds and not just projects in the park, but also other species, fish, bald eagles. Some of you might be familiar with the bald eagle webcam. That's a Montrose project in part, peregrine falcon recovery, and also other islands like San Nicolas, a few islands in Baja, and so on and so forth. But I work solely in Channel Islands National Park. And so that's what I'll be talking about. And before I get started, I want to point out that these projects are very collaborative. We have a lot of different, very talented and dedicated biologists who help us out on the projects, who collaborate, and so on and so forth, including the Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, several nonprofits, and very fortunate to work also with several universities who provide us slave labor in the form of graduate students. And also many volunteers, many of whom come from the Naturalist Corps here at Channel Islands. So I have 4 main projects at the moment that I'm working on. The first and largest, as I mentioned, is the alcid project on SBI. We also have a restoration project on Scorpion Rock offshore Santa Cruz for the Cassin's Auklet. We are restoring ashy storm petrel colonies on offshore rocks and sea caves of Santa Cruz Island. And our latest and greatest project is basically an assessment for all 3 of the main target species identified in the plan to see whether we want to do restoration on the Anacapa Islands. So Santa Barbara Island, how many of you have been to Santa Barbara Island? Oh wow, not a representative sample. So you know that it's small, you know that there's a rather steep flight of stairs to the top of the island. So bear that in mind as I talk about all of our restoration work. It's the smallest and southernmost of the Channel Islands. It's about 1 square mile in size. It has a large islet off the southwestern tip, that's Sutil Island, and another small, where's the pointer? There it is, another relatively small offshore rock, Shag Rock. And those features are pretty important because the island was very impacted, like most islands. And so Shag Rock and Sutil Island really served as refugia for our seabird species and other species as well. So we started, I was hired in January 2007, and we started pilot work on SBI in the same year. We're expected to keep going through 2017, fingers crossed. It's a real interesting project because it has sort of multiple components. We're working with 2 seabird species, but lots of different plant species, different problems on the island, and it's just a really great opportunity to look at the ecosystem as a whole and work on a multifaceted project. So again, our 2 species that we're looking at and trying to restore habitat for on SBI are the Xantus' Murrelet and the Cassin's Auklet. Just very brief breeding biology of these species. The Murrelet, they're both in the Alcid family. The Murrelet is sort of your typical black and white seabird. It looks like a little Nerf ball. They typically lay 2 eggs per clutch. The female of this species has a hard time because, whoops, what happened? Oh, forward. There we go. Those 2 eggs can comprise 45% of the female's body weight. Very large eggs. So be glad you're not a Murrelet female. Typically, they go through a period of prospecting, courtship, and lay the first of 2 eggs in their nest site. And then they leave that egg for about a week. They forage at sea, and so the egg is alone in the nest site. It makes it very vulnerable to predation. The female returns to complete the clutch and initiates incubation, both eggs at the same time. It's about 30 days until the chicks hatch, and they leave the nest site when they're just little tiny balls of fluff at about 2 days old. They can't fly yet, so they sort of walk and tumble and make their way down to the edge of a sea cliff or an offshore rock, make their way to the sea, and join their parents for the rest of their fledging period. We don't know how long that takes. This species is pretty hard to study, and that'll become more apparent later in the talk. Importantly, on Santa Barbara Island, a large part of their nesting habitat is located under native shrubs. And this is only one of 2 places in the world where these Murrelets are known to use shrub habitat, the other being a little rock off Guadalupe Island. They'll also nest in rocky crevices. Cassin's Auklets, on the other hand, actively excavate burrows. So they form these colonies that are just tunnels, burrows riddling the soil. They typically lay 1 egg and raise their chicks in the nest, so provision the chick in the nest all the way to fledging about 41 days after hatch. And Cassin's Auklets can actually rear more than 1 clutch per season, depending on food availability. So why restore Cassin's Auklets to Santa Barbara Island? This is a timeline starting in 1863 and going through 1994. And most of these early references are pulled from really fascinating field notes from early naturalists, people who visited the island and made notes about the vegetation and whatever they saw. And they're great. It gives us an indication of presence and absence and general location, but we don't have any good information about numbers or exactly where the colonies were located. What we do know that starting in 1863, which is the earliest reference I could find, and going through about 1899, there was a large colony on Santa Barbara Island. But starting in the early 1900s, it looked like most of the auklets had been killed. There was a feral cat population on the island, and they did a number on the auklets as well as many other species. Skipping ahead 80 years to 1991, Harry Carter et al. Found very small numbers still nesting on the island, but confined to the rocky perimeter of the island and the offshore islets. And that situation was found in the next survey, 1994. So clearly a massive decline of this colony, and this is why we chose this species for restoration on the island, one reason. Xantus's murrelets, on the other hand, persisted on Santa Barbara Island in larger numbers. They also were greatly reduced from historic numbers. Worldwide, they're a rare bird with maybe in the vicinity of 10,000 individuals. And Santa Barbara Island is their largest breeding location. Luckily, we've had long-term monitoring on SBI since the 1970s, and that information from that monitoring showed a continued decline on the island, which led to in part to their being listed as threatened in the state of California. There's been a petition to list them under the ESA for many, many years, but it's sitting on someone's desk. So this is some data from the earlier monitoring years, 1985 through 2002. And this is the exact data that was used in the listing petition in 2003. So on the y-axis, you have percent of occupied nest sites. So these are sites that have been tagged and tracked throughout the years. 1985 through 02. The blue line is one of two long-term monitoring plots, Canyon, and we'll talk more about this plot a little bit later. And the red line, another plot, Nature Trail. And you can see that there's a significant decline through time at both plots in occupancy, and we think that this more than likely reflects a colony-wide decline. Importantly, the two plots are comprised of very different habitat. So Cat Canyon on the right is mostly rocky crevice habitat. This is at the extreme southern end of the island. There's lots of cholla down there. So monitoring is not for the faint of heart. Versus on the left, the Nature Trail plot habitat. Most of the murrelet nest sites were located under native shrubs, a few rocky crevice habitats, but primarily shrubs. And on the bottom left is silver lace. And most of the nest sites during that time frame were located under silver lace. But, let's see. Let me go back. Oh, wait, I'm pointing at the wrong thing. Okay. Many of those silver lace shrubs died during a drought. There was a marked decline in shrub cover in the Nature Trail plot all through the 90s and 2000s. And so that was a cause for major concern for the murrelets. So the restoration premise is pretty straightforward. The vegetation on the island, which supports both Cassin's Auklet and Xantus's murrelet nesting habitat, had been severely denuded by introduced herbivores, particularly rabbits. I think there were 2 separate rabbit introductions on the island, and they ate everything. There was also farming on the island, primarily European oats. There was a little bit of grazing and other human activities which served to further degrade the habitat structure. And of course, when you disturb an island and bring non-native plants in, you have a concurrent increase in non-native vegetation, which creates a difficult problem. They limit structural habitat. Invasives also prevent native plant recruitment, if there are any natives remaining to recruit. And they alter the soil structure, which is very important for Cassin's Auklets. Burrows need, root structure to maintain their integrity so they don't just collapse. And they alter the soil composition. The goals, again, were pretty straightforward, or so I thought when I took the job. Let's enhance murrelet nesting habitat by growing plants. We're going to increase the native plant habitat, try to approximate what we think a native plant community structure should look like on the island. And at the same time, we're going to reduce the exotics. And, by the way, will you please restore a historic colony of auklets? So this means increasing edge habitat, again, improving stability. And with auklets, we know that we can advertise our restored areas. Very social animals, they call in their colonies at night, and so we have some techniques that we think might use for them. So basically, our first order of business was to tackle the plant community structure. How do we grow plants on a desert island? What does it take to do that? How do we do the permitting? And will the park take us there, right? So first, we wanted to identify our restoration sites, and we looked at a whole bunch of different parameters to do this. Proximity to known nesting. Was there any structural plant habitat existing? Other factors. We wanted to start restoration. Once we got a little farther along with our plant restoration, we wanted to advertise with social attraction for Auklets. And then, of course, you have to assess everything with annual monitoring. So that's the changes in plant community structure as well as the changes in the 2 seabird species on the island. I'm not going to talk a lot about methods. I'm just going to go through them briefly. Native plants, pretty simple. You have to collect seeds and propagate plants. Well, we had decided early on that to limit the potential to introduce any more non-native species, microbes, what have you, we were going to do everything on island, on a desert island with no water. That comes into play later. Remember those stairs, right? So we chose a few restoration plots to work on as our pilot areas in 2007. You have to pre-survey to figure out what's there to begin with. Are there any other resource issues that you need to avoid? And then outplant, weed, water, monitor, weed, water, weed, water. So we started with a little temporary shade house in 2007 on the top there. This is basically one of those structures that you see in people's driveways, but instead of canvas on the top, it's shade cloth. And this is what we could carry up the stairs on our back. The first one, I think we had a sort of planned obsolescence built in, and I think we took it down / it fell down in about 2008, and we replaced it with another one. And after doing that twice, we really decided that we needed to figure out a better plan. We also were learning that everything on Santa Barbara Island needs to be completely mouse-proof. Your nice, large plant in a gallon container, if you set it on the ground and the mice are hungry, they're quite happy to mow it to the roots. So that was a painful learning experience, my first year. And like I said, we decided we needed a bigger boat, as it were. So with some of those many, many volunteers and several trips, and incorporating now helicopter operations into our program, we started leveling the site. We flew up lumber and so on and so forth, and designed the nursery on many cocktail napkins. I mean, carefully designed the nursery. This is us. We had to, there was a little bit more of a grade than I anticipated, so the pick and shovel work was pretty extensive. But the end result was nice. We have these retaining walls. You can see on the bottom right that we planted natives in there. And those plants are now quite large. We also designed the nursery with a subfloor to catch rainwater. So that's an 800 square foot rainwater catchment. And we finally finished it last year and grew all of our crop for last year, about 7,500 plants in that nursery. So pretty happy with it. And as you can see, the view is not too bad. People enjoy working there. So back to our restoration approach. Okay, we know how to grow plants. We know not to put the plants where mice can eat them. We've figured out some of the water issues, and we've built a nursery. So here's the next simple step, initiate restoration. Well, that brings up a few questions. What kind of plants do we want to cultivate? And to decide that, we looked at a couple of things. For Murrelets, we had good information on the plant species that they were utilizing on the island already, so we could target those. We looked at the historic literature. The Halverson et al. Papers were really useful in describing plant community types and so on and so forth. But one thing that I want to point out now is that restoration is often at least part art and part science. And I figured that out in the first year or two. When I had, originally tried to put I will put 10 plants evenly spaced in this. It doesn't work. You have to really incorporate a whole lot of different variables when you're planning restoration. I needed to know what kind of planting density was required to start seeing natural recruitment and so on and so forth. What was their survivorship going to look like, growth rates, how big did they need to be, and do you really need to water native plants? So to do that, I spent the first couple of years, 2007 and 2008, doing pilot work. This is one of our plots. We call it Northeast Flats. It's on the east side of North Peak. And those of you who have been out to Santa Barbara Island, it's when you go up to the first switchback and look up the hill, it's basically in what used to be a monoculture of, near monoculture of European oat, as you can see in that top photo. Bottom photo is a shot of some of our fall outplantings in 2007. And they look really tiny. So we started out with 4 main species in this plot and looked at survivorship and growth rates. Again, I'm not going to show a ton of data for you tonight. If anyone's interested, please let me know. But the first year, we decided not to water the plants other than when we first put them in the ground. And we ended up with, a little bit of a range. Coreopsis did real well. Overall, about 62% in this plot out of just under 600 plants. Second plot, Prohibition Point. So named because we found while we were planting our plants a lot of old liquor jugs from probably the Hyder era. Didn't do quite as well. This has a slightly more southern aspect. Aspect is incredibly important, as any gardener knows. Smaller sample size and a lower survivorship. So we used this information to kind of adjust our planting palette and scheme and see what we thought would do well in each plot. Here's 2007. Again, this is Northeast Flats. We're dealing with the non-native European oat here. This is after 3 years of outplanting. So you can see that there's still a lot of grass in there, but you're starting to get some larger shrubs. Coreopsis are growing, and slowly we're seeing a change. I should mention that the 2008 rainy season, 2007 to 2008, was horrible. And so it was pretty daunting after the first year to go out and do my growth measurements for the plants from the previous year and find that they had actually shrunk. They were still alive, but they were smaller. Then it started getting better in 2010. And just as a note, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but that's a solar panel for our Auklet sound system. This is another one of our plots. It's located over above Elephant Seal Cove on these slopes here. Different situation. Rather than the oats, we're dealing with over 95% cover of crystalline ice plant. So the mesembryanthemum is particularly troubling. It's a real problem on the island. And not only does it physically, sort of carpet the ground and prevent recruitment and so on and so forth, but it actually alters the soil chemistry. So we're dealing with a hypersaline situation in these restoration areas. And it's tough. It's tough to deal with that because some plants do a little bit better, and most of them, if you can get them installed and through their first year, they're not going to recruit into the saline soil, they're not going to grow well. So as I said, lots of different situations on the island, even though it's tiny. And I just want to point out, I mentioned that the Cassin's Auklet surveys in 1994 had found small numbers, and this is where they were located, right down here. So a rather precipitous little scramble down off the point of elephant seal. Don't try this at home. And then they nest back in this ledge. So we started the first couple of years with carrying everything out to our outplanting sites on our back. That was plants, water, materials, everything we needed. And then we got smart and we talked to Charlie at Aspen and we figured out how to fly stuff around the island. And that was probably the best decision I've made as a program manager. Helicopters are awesome. They move a lot of stuff. I think this particular day, I calculated that we moved like 17,000 pounds of plants, water, and restoration materials. I've been real lucky to have a core Seabird team who works very hard and has fun with it. And this is an example of one of our plot areas. This is a relatively steep area. And so this is erosion control fabric, and we plant into that fabric. It's quite helpful. And here's our watering system. We fly the barrels over full, we line them up, and then we gravity feed with hoses to the restoration area. And we now water our plants in for their first year, and that's really improved our success. But as you can see, it's pretty labor intensive, and it takes a lot of time to do restoration like this. We're looking at about a 45-minute hike each way to get to this plot. How many of you have worked over there with me? You have? 2? Okay. Sign-up sheet will be in the back. So here's an overview of the areas that we are working currently. We're looking at about 4.5 acres right now, over 5 plots. We're trying to diversify as much as possible. And we're getting close to the 16,000 plant mark. Most of those plants, after we did our size trials, most of those plants go into 3/4 or 1/4 gallons, so they're quite large when they go on the ground. And we're restoring to a whole bunch of different habitat types, depending on the location and what species we're targeting. So for example, Northeast Flats has a nice soil horizon. It's quite deep, and we think that it would be great for the burrow excavators like the Cassin's Auklets, whereas the areas down here on the cliffy spots are more for the Xantus' Murrelet. The soil horizon is lower, but the Murrelets like to nest relatively close to the cliff, so their chicks can make it to the ocean. Oh, and I should point out, over 10,000 volunteer hours to date. That doesn't include this last year, actually. Again, sign-up sheets in the back. And as I mentioned earlier, we wanted to advertise our newly restored habitat to see what it would take to get birds to recruit into these areas. So we have 2 techniques. The first is artificial nest burrows. These we developed templates, prototypes for during another project, the Scorpion Rock project. We used temperature loggers and so on and so forth to make sure that they were appropriate for Auklets. And I've got 100 out on the island right now in groups of 20. And, oh yes, we started our nocturnal broadcast here at Landing Cove in 2009. So, the question, now that we know how, well, we're starting to know how to restore the plants, if you build it, are they actually going to show up? Well, it depends, right? It depends on a lot of factors, some of which we know. So obviously you have to look at population growth. Are there birds that are recruiting and reaching breeding age? That depends on a whole bunch of different things, food availability, predation on primarily adults is one of our main concerns, and other factors. With seabirds, you're also looking at social cues, which are not well known for either of these species. What we really like when we're looking at seabird restoration is sort of a core of birds that have a site memory. So, restoration theory is, it's pretty well documented that if you have still, even if it's a small remnant population, it's much easier to restore a colony site rather than starting from zero. And that goes into the natal phylopatry that most seabirds exhibit. And then there are lots of other factors that, again, are not well described for either one of these species, and certainly not at this location. So I don't really like pictures of myself, but these are 2 chicks, and 2 Murrelet chicks, and you can see how tiny they are. We only capture Murrelets at sea because early studies in the 1980s showed that adults will abandon the nest if they're handled. So we nest check, but we don't touch the adults. We try to do captures every year to get some banded individuals into the population without disturbing them. But again, they're tiny when they go to sea. They are literally this big, and you just wonder what they're how they make it. So what we're looking at, again, is reproductive monitoring. And to do that, we do land-based nest monitoring for Murrelets throughout the breeding season, which goes from mid to late February, typically into early June, but sometimes as late as July. And we also added some other survey techniques to try to figure out how well we were doing with our land-based monitoring. Cassin's Auklet was a bit more difficult because, as I will show later, we didn't have any indication that they were nesting on Santa Barbara Island proper when I started the project. We found none in 2007 and none in 2008. So how do you figure out what's going on? So we added some at-sea surveys in 2009, repeating transects that had been done in the early 80s by George Hunt, very famous seabird biologist. And we also beefed up our shoreline searches, so that's boat-based work where we skiff ashore and search as much habitat as we can. Again, I'm not going to go too much into the actual methods. As I mentioned, we have land-based surveys, so we have a team on the island throughout the breeding season. We've added boat-based surveys. These guys are nocturnal, so any banding work that you want to do has to be done at night. We've done a bit of prey sampling in conjunction with those at-sea surveys that I mentioned. And we also added some nest cameras to our known Xantus' Murrelet sites in order to help us understand what their breeding biology was. We really don't know that much about this species because, as I mentioned, they are so sensitive to disturbance that we don't want to intrude on their nesting activity. And we've spent many evenings and early mornings mist netting for Auklets. So here's just some examples of what we do. My team is never happy. They don't like birds at all. This is a brood patch, so when we do capture birds, we want to know, because we're capturing them at sea or in mist nets, we want to know if they're breeding. So this is a good example of a defeathered brood patch. And then just a typical shoreline work shot. Oh, and this is, you guys want to see a video of some of the first Xantus' Murrelet ever captured on camera? Plus I'm getting hoarse. So Josh is going to cue that up for you. I'm just hoarse. That's what we always say. Can't we just take one home? So these cameras, I mentioned the bald eagle project earlier. You guys have probably heard the name Peter Sharp. He flew out to the island with me to set these up. So he actually scoped he told me what to do, and then he came out and showed me what to do. But what we wanted to do is find cameras that obviously weren't going to disturb the birds. So these have no noise, no lights, infrared, and they're great. We're getting a lot of good information from them. What I'm finding is that it takes a long time to go through video, a long, long time. And so most of it is archived for the time being, but we're learning about prospecting. We have courtship behavior on film, we have copulation, we have egg laying. And so all of those things are going to help us figure out how to work with these birds. What are their cues? What are they dialing into when they're prospecting for nest sites? These are things that we really need to figure out if we're going to use our time and energy efficiently in these restoration projects. So I just wanted to give you a little glimpse of her or him. That's good, Josh. Unless you guys want to see more. And also, it's hard to recruit volunteers for these because this is literally all they do, except for like 99% of the time. But they do blink, Okay, so what have we found? This is the same type of data that I showed you earlier from the listing petition, so it's occupancy. But it's from one plot only, and the reason for that is that one of my beloved species, the brown pelican, has expanded its nesting on Santa Barbara Island and decided that the long-term nature trail plot would be a great place to set up. So we can no longer access that during most years since 2006. So unfortunately, we only have one plot now that we're looking at that has that real long-term site catalog that you can use to sort of standardize occupancy with. But it's interesting, what we're seeing now from 1993 through, these are our years, 2007 through 11, is this line, as you can see, has flattened. So whereas before you saw a real significant decline through time, now there's no significant change, right? And so you would think that would be encouraging, and it is. It's nice not to see this. But we were real concerned about our sample size and also a lot of other factors with the Cat Canyon plot. It's a certain habitat type that may not be representative of the whole island. And we've also lost a lot of those early site catalog, so it's real important to just monitor the same ones every year. But the rock on this island is very crumbly, and a lot of those sites have collapsed or disappeared. Some we haven't been able to monitor because, again, our friends, the brown pelicans, like the opuntia around the area. And so we were real concerned about sample size. So we added spotlight surveys we did limited surveys in 2008 and then complete surveys in 2009 and 2010. And Daryl Whitworth, you guys might recognize his name. He was the one who did all of the Murrelet monitoring on Anacapa following the rat eradication, is the PI on this project. And a couple interesting things here. So on the left, don't worry about the numbers. Basically, the size of the bubbles represent the relative numbers of murrelets around the island. The left is a sample from one of our 2009 surveys, the right from 2010. One real interesting thing to note is the distribution around the island. So with just a couple of exceptions, they're very widely distributed. This, I don't know if it's has anything to do with this, but this is the major sea lion haul out. And we think that they don't really like to nest in here. And there's also no habitat in that area. It's all flattened by sea lions. I'm not sure what's going on here. There's nice habitat around that Webster Point. But regardless, this is, when you're thinking about management problems and things like squid fishery and impacts from other sources, it's very important to know where the birds are hanging out. So that's good information in and of itself. But also what we're seeing is 2010 was a banner year. I mean, we're still looking at data from 2010. They just nested everywhere. And it made my life very interesting. But we were happy for them. We really were. 30% increase that we saw between these 2 years. But back at Cat Canyon for the same 2 years, 1%. So, how well are we doing with our land-based monitoring? It's very important to do these, sort of expanded surveys to check in and make sure that you're actually sampling what you're trying to capture. And, if you look at it from this perspective, I think that everyone's in agreement that these spotlight surveys have more potential to accurately represent what's happening with the colony as a whole. Problems, the downfalls are they're expensive. You need a support vessel. You need a targeted project. When you're doing spotlight surveys, you're out until 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. There's not a lot of habitat searching during the day that you want to do. But we are fortunate to have the Montrose program supporting that work, and we're planning to repeat these surveys near the end of the project. And that'll help us assess how well we're doing or what's happening with the restoration. So, what's the population size? You guys want to read this? The K correction factor, we have somewhere in the vicinity of 500 pairs, okay? But here are the ranges. This is still a lot better data than we could ever have come up with from plot-based, land-based monitoring alone. So take home here is that monitoring seabirds is difficult, it's expensive, and it takes a lot of effort. This is pretty good data. And I should say that these population estimates are still lower than the early population estimates that George Hunt did in 1981-ish. So we're not seeing a huge increase through the last, decades. What's the trend? You guys can read this straight from our report. We don't know. We can't say for sure. We don't have enough years of comparably collected data. And so what we do know is that there's a lot of interannual variation. Again, that 2010 year was the biggest I've seen. We had multiple nest attempts. We had nest site competition, which we'd never really seen before. And so it's probably somewhat anomalous. It's at the high end, but you want to capture those high years because that gets more to the point of how many birds are there, which is just so difficult to do with species like this. So we need to repeat the surveys. I think it's fine to take a few years off, but then importantly, you don't want to just do 1 year of monitoring. You want to do at least as many as you can, but at least 2 to account for that high degree of interannual variability. All right, so regardless of how many there are, say there are 1,000 breeding birds or 500 pairs on the island, how well are they doing? Because it doesn't matter how many birds you have, if they're not reproducing, that you're going to have a negative population growth. This slide's a little bit busy, don't worry about it too much. This is hatching success on the y-axis, and these are our different monitoring plots. I'm not going to worry about that. With the black bar being a long-term mean from 93 to 2003, just for comparison, and these being the years of our project, so 2007 through 2011. Again, don't worry about the number, but the take-home message here is there's variability among years and also among plots. So again, this gets to the sampling question. How much do you need to sample? Time and resources are limited. We can't monitor every single nest on the island. But what this is telling us is that we need to monitor as many different locations as we can and in an annual fashion. I don't say anything else. Oh, yes, I did want to say something else. So remember I said that Cat Canyon was one of the long-term monitoring plots, mainly crevice habitat. Landing Cove, we established a new plot in Landing Cove, which is also one of our restoration areas. There was existing habitat there and some nests. We're adding more habitat, and this is all shrub habitat. And what we're finding is that murrelets that are nesting in the shrubs that we monitor are overall doing better than at Cat Canyon, as you can see. So that's encouraging. It means we're on the right track. You know, more plant habitat is going to be better for murrelets. Had some bad news. So back to the expanded surveys. We found this during one of our more extended, this is 2009. We were searching as much shoreline habitat, all of the sea caves, and so on and so forth. And this is a barn owl cave is the name. This is where we found this. So this is a site of a long-term barn owl nesting pair. This is from one season. So we went in and cleaned out the entire cave before the barn owls started nesting. And then we went in at the end of the season. And I think the total here was, not remembering, about 71 carcasses. 1 year, 1 barn owl pair. We have a major predation issue on Santa Barbara Island. And let's see where to start. It's sort of what came first, the horse or the cart. The barn owl problem has been documented for many, many years. We have extremely high densities of barn owls in some years in the 30s. That's a lot of owls for 1 square mile island. And what we're seeing is that the barn owl population tends to track the deer mouse population as a native deer mouse. Again, the deer mouse population is very boom bust on this island. And we think it's all tied to changes in vegetation in the plant community structure. Haven't been able to document that entire link yet, but in 2009 we brought a grad student on to start tackling this problem. How many owls are there? Where are they located? How many are breeding? So she's been doing lots of work. She is our night owl on the island. She's put telemetry tags on a bunch of birds and chased them around the island to get at home range and predation and so on and so forth. So that project is underway. We're going to wrap up the second full year of it at the end of this summer. And I'm expecting to have some management recommendations come out of that, so stay tuned. So back to Cassin's Auklets. Well, all right, I condensed the timeline. Exterminated, 1911, that's not good. Few here, few there. 2008, we did more extensive surveys than had been done for 15 years, but not completely extensive. We didn't find any on the main island. In 2009, at the same time we were doing the spotlight surveys and the extended shoreline searches, we added in habitat searching. And we found the first confirmed nesting since 1994. That was a really great day because it meant that we do have birds on the main island with that site memory. But still, the nesting on the main island is still confined to the perimeter. No burrow nesting at all rocky crevice. And so it was, it was good, but there aren't many of them. I also started social attraction in 2009. We had no birds recruiting into, remember the landing cove areas where we were using social attraction? None in 2009. None in 2010. And then 2011, we had our first Auklets. We set up these little spy cams, Reconyx cameras, and it caught birds coming in and out at night, which we wouldn't have known about otherwise. And then we had our first bird peeking out of one of our artificial sites shortly thereafter. I think that was January in 2011. And we ended up actually with about 16 active sites in that year. Now, social attraction has been used for a whole bunch of different seabird species, but it had never been tried for auklets before. So super encouraging to see that they actually will come in to the sound. And it means, again, that we're on the right track there. Unfortunately, in 2011, we also saw some carcasses in our social attraction area. So back to the barn owl issue, it was, oh yay, they're nesting, oh yay, oh no, they're getting killed. So we shut everything down, we revamped the whole system, we moved everything closer to the water, we added cover boards and so on and so forth. And looking at the owl population increase, and the mouse population starting to crash, what we think is happening is that the barn owls switch from mice to seabirds as the mouse population drops. We decided not to implement the social attraction this year. They said, that's it, until we figure out what's going on with the owls, we're not going to attract any more birds to the island. Well, they still decided to come in smaller numbers. So again, real good information. Many species, you do years and years and years and years of social attraction before, and then all of a sudden you get a success. So Steve Kress works on Project Puffin in Maine, and he's sort of the father of seabird social attraction, I guess. We're all geeks, so we love him. But that's what he says in all of his talks. You have to be really patient, And then you got to make sure it sticks. Sometimes it takes 10 years, sometimes it takes 5. Well, we got them in 3 years, and without the sound on, they decided to keep coming in this year in lower numbers. So that's good. We have had a few carcasses, which is upsetting, but so far nothing like we saw in this range. So we're hopeful. What else about this? Yeah, they should be fledging in a couple of weeks from Santa Barbara. Okay, so what have we learned? Oh, here's a photo of one of our revamped. So this is artificial burrows, which are in the ground, and we have cover boards to help protect them from predation. And this is where our Auklet condos have been active. That's what we call them. These are the lower condos, the closest ones to the water. So we've learned with plants, plant densely. If you spread them out too much, you're just, they're not going to do as well. You want patchy, dense plantings, which makes it more difficult to plan, more difficult to monitor, more difficult to weed, but much more effective in the long run. Also, watering them in well for the first year. Anybody who's a gardener knows this. Even if they're native plants, people ask me time and time again, why do you need to water them? They're natives. Well, even natives need water, and they don't recruit in every year. So you're trying to sort of speed up the process here so you can tip the balance back to a more natural habitat. This is a big one. Plant restoration takes time. Minimum of 5 years per plot before you can expect to see a major change. And that, of course, depends on rainfall. It depends a lot on how well you're able to maintain, which depends on staff and so on and so forth. But the point is, you can't rush it. And, with the early pulse of energy that goes into restoration, it doesn't make sense to throw a lot of effort at it and to walk away. You have to maintain and got to stick with it. We have a predation problem. And we have, which brings up sort of an ethical dilemma. We do not want to attract birds to a site that, while we may be restoring some plant habitat, we have another situation that's probably resulting from the island being completely out of balance. So we've got to figure that out before we go forward. More work is needed to determine trends, and this is not just for our restoration project, even though that's where the funding comes from and it's the sort of point source for that work. It's important for the population as a whole to know what's happening with it, especially for the Murrelets, because we are hosting their largest colony. It's a very important site for them. So annual monitoring, and this is the good news. Auklets respond to social attraction. So once we figure out our other problems, we know that we can attract them to habitat that we think is going to be suitable for them. Next steps, briefly. If our knees and backs hold out, we're going through 2017, we hope. We'd like to continue, we're of course going to continue increasing shrub density in existing plots. Plot expansion, again, because of that minimum 5-year timeline, we're going to have to be real careful about what we start to make sure we can finish it. And that'll depend on funding availability primarily. We'll continue to monitor both species, and we'll repeat those more extensive surveys, both the spotlight surveys and hopefully the at-sea radial transects, which give us a lot of information about both our seabirds and their prey toward the end of the project. So planned for 2016, 2017 is my hope. And we'll keep on planting. So before I stop, a big thank you to the Seabird team, both past and present. I'm just very lucky to work with great people out there in the islands. Everybody's enthusiastic and they're just jazzed to be doing work like this. We all love our jobs. The Montrose Council, especially Jen and Annie. Transportation, these people get us to and from our sites and make sure we're safe. And I can't overemphasize how important that is for these projects, both the boat skippers, We work primarily with the park skippers, but also the sanctuary and some independent people. Aspen Helicopters comes and gets us if the seas are too rough for the boat, and also flies all of our materials around. It's amazing to watch them work. They can put a 800-pound load on a dime. They're just incredible. And then lots of collaborators and all the people at the park. So with that, I'll be happy to take questions.
All right, let me walk around with the microphone here.
I came in just a little bit late, but the owl population, are they native to there, or is that human introduced?
They're native. They probably emigrated from Catalina Island or even the mainland. But we suspect that there's not a lot of flow. So we think it's a resident population, high juvenile mortality. So you see this, again, this boom-bust population. As part of the graduate project that I mentioned, we're planning to do genetic studies to see how closely related they are to their neighbors.
All right, let me come up front here.
May I have two questions? One, is there any plans of maybe capturing the owls like we did the golden eagles one? And I was just curious, how much does a helicopter cost for a day?
For you or for me? No. It depends on the size of the helicopter. Small helicopter is about $1,000 an hour. Large helicopter is about $1,500 an hour, I think. Sorry, I got distracted by the money. What was your first question?
I was curious whether or not there was any plans to capture the owls.
Well, I think that, before you do a project of that scope, it's really important to know exactly what the dynamics are on the island, and that's why we're doing this more prolonged study. Sarah, our grad student, has also experimented with capture methods, so to band them and to outfit them with transmitters. So all of that information would go into a management recommendation, and before you could do a project like that, you'd have to do permitting and so on and so forth. So stay tuned, I guess, is the answer.
A comment and a question. On Guadalupe Island, we had a presentation. I'm with California Native Plant Society, and it took about 15-20 years for their restoration to have an effect. So I agree with you, it's going to take some time, but a lot of natural recruitment is probably going to occur.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is a question about the predation. Since some of your birds are tagged and banded, are the birds that are preyed upon mostly the juveniles, or and are they outside birds that are coming in, non-banded birds?
That's a great question, and I wish I could answer it with a this is it. But in order to see that kind of demography, you have to have a pretty large proportion of the population banded, and we're not at that level yet. So one of the things that we're trying to do with these captures is get more birds banded. So we start not only getting a market capture study, but seeing what the owl kills are targeting. And we did actually just have our first banded bird. It was banded in 2010, found on the island in owl kill. And there have been 3 or 4 in the past that actually ashy storm petrels found in the owl caves. So again, more work is needed. We need a better sample size in order to even start teasing out that information.
All right. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and I'm going to go ahead and conclude questions at that point. We want to thank Laurie for her talk tonight. Thank you very much. And we hope to see you all back in the autumn. Our next talk again will be in September. So thank you all tonight.